So here's a thing I only really clocked as an adult. Avatar. The Last Airbender starts with a 12-year-old boy waking up from a century-long sleep, and later finding out that everyone he has ever loved was murdered while he was asleep. That's the opening act. On Nickelodeon, between adverts for breakfast cereal. And I don't think any of us processed that at the time. I certainly didn't. I was watching it for the flying bison. Tonight we're going to wander through the bits of this show that people have been quietly pulling at for 20 years now. Some of it is fan theory, some of it is confirmed canon that got buried in a novel or a DVD commentary that almost nobody read. Some of it is just production history that turned out to be sadder than anything in the script. I'll tell you which is which as we go, so you're never wondering whether I've made something up. If you like this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere. No pressure either way. Right, let's start at the temple. There's a shot in episode 3 that I think about far more often than a person should think about a cartoon. Aang has flown home to the southern air temple. He spent the whole episode insisting that everything's fine, that the monks are probably just off somewhere, that the Fire Nation couldn't possibly have got up there because airbenders can fly and firebenders can't. And then he wanders into a room and there's a pile of bones in an orange and yellow robe and a necklace he recognises. That's Gyatso. That's the man who raised him. And around Gyatso, scattered across the floor, are dozens of Fire Nation helmets, skeletons in armour, a lot of them. Now here's the detail that turned this into one of the most discussed images in the whole fandom. There are no scorch marks, nothing is burnt. Gyatso isn't burnt. The floor isn't burnt. You've got a room full of dead firebenders and no fire. The theory goes that Gyatso killed them by pulling the air out of their lungs. And the reason that theory has legs isn't wishful thinking, it's that we eventually got to watch someone do exactly that on screen. In The Legend of Korra, an airbender called Zahir suffocates people, deliberately. It's presented as a real technique that a sufficiently skilled and sufficiently ruthless airbender can perform, which means the thing fans had been inferring from a background detail for years turned out to be mechanically possible within the rules of the world. I want to be clear that this has never been confirmed. Nobody at Nickelodeon has come out and said, yes, that's what happened in that room. It's inference, but it's inference built on a piece of set dressing that somebody had to sit down and deliberately draw, and the absence of fire in a room full of firebenders is a strange thing to draw by accident. What it means, if it's true, is fairly bleak. Gyatso was an air nomad monk. Air nomads are pacifists. It's not a personality trait, it's the entire spiritual architecture of their culture. So for Gyatso to do that, he'd have had to abandon everything he believed in about 90 seconds before he died, and he'd have had to do it knowing he was going to die anyway. He didn't survive it. Whether he suffocated himself in the process or simply ran out a temple to defend, he's on that floor with them. Pretty grim thing to leave in the background of a children's show. But let's back up, because the mechanics of what actually happened to the air nomads are worth going through properly, and the show is genuinely quite careful about it. Fire Lord Sozin worked out that the Avatar cycle was the only thing standing between the Fire Nation and total control of the world. Roku, the Avatar before Aang, had been a firebender and Roku was dead, which meant the next Avatar would be born an air nomad. Sozin didn't know which one. He didn't need to know which one. Then Sozin's comet arrived. The comet passes close to the world roughly once a century, and while it's overhead, it amplifies firebending to a genuinely absurd degree. Sozin used that window to attack all 4 air temples simultaneously and wipe out an entire people, on the reasoning that if you kill every airbender, you've killed the Avatar somewhere in there. And the thing that makes it work as a strategy is a piece of world building I find quietly horrifying. The air nomads are the only nation where every single person could bend. Not most, not the gifted ones, all of them. In the water tribes, benders are a minority. In the Earth Kingdom, benders are a minority. In the Fire Nation, benders are a minority. But every air nomad was an airbender, which means there was no civilian population to spare. There was no way to target only the benders, because targeting only the benders was targeting everyone. The extermination was clean in a way the other three nations would never have allowed. I don't think the show ever says that out loud. It's just sitting there, in the world building, waiting for you to work it out on your own. Now, the other big theory in this area, and this one has been running since roughly 2006, is that the genocide can't possibly have been total. The argument is a logistics argument, and it's a good one. You've got 4 temples spread across an enormous world: northern, southern, eastern, western. They're in different regions. The comet is overhead for a matter of hours, not days. And crucially, the air nomads are nomads. It's in the name. These are people whose entire culture is built around not being in one place. There are traders, travellers, pilgrims, people between temples on flying bison at any given moment. So the odds that every single member of a nomadic civilization happen to be sitting inside one of 4 buildings on one specific afternoon are, statistically, not great. Fans have been making this case for years, and for years the official answer was essentially, no, they're all dead. That's the premise of the show, please stop asking. Aang is the last airbender. It's the title, except the franchise has now started walking into exactly this territory itself. The 2026 Avatar Studios film, Avatar Aang, The Last Airbender, has Aang encountering an ancient airbender called Targa, who was frozen on a mountain, and a lost avatar called Sonam. Which is not the same as saying a bunch of air nomads survived and set up shop somewhere, but it's the franchise poking at the same soft spot the fandom has been poking at for 2 decades. And honestly, I think there's something a bit sad about that soft spot, because the reason people want survivors isn't really a lore argument. It's that nobody wants the answer to be, yes, they all died, and there was nothing anyone could have done, and the boy has to carry that for the rest of his life. Which, of course, is precisely what the show's about. There's one more detail from this whole sequence that stuck with me, and it's a small one. When Aang finds Gyatso, he goes into the avatar state, full glowing eyes, wind tearing the mountain apart. It's the first time in the series we see it happen from grief rather than danger, and the thing that pulls him out of it is Katara telling him that he's not alone. Not that it's going to be all right, not that there might be survivors, just that she's there. That's the whole show, really. The show never once tells Aang that what happened wasn't as bad as he thinks. It just keeps putting people next to him. Anyway, talking a bit about what Aang actually missed while he was down there under all that ice. The thing everyone remembers is the iceberg. Katara cracks it open. There's a beam of light, and out comes a bald kid with an arrow on his head, who immediately asks if she wants to go penguin sledding. The thing fewer people remember is why he was in there. Aang ran away. That's the actual sequence of events. The monks told him he was the Avatar years earlier than they were meant to, because the world was heading towards war and they needed him ready. And then they went further. They decided that his friendship with Gyatso was interfering with his training, and they were going to send him to the Eastern Air Temple to be trained by somebody else, away from the only father figure he had. So a 12-year-old did what a 12-year-old does. He took his bison and he went in the middle of the night in a storm, and the storm nearly drowned him, and the Avatar state kicked in and froze him in a ball of ice at the bottom of the ocean. And while he was down there, the comet came, and everyone he knew died, and the war ran for a century. Now, there is a whole strand of fan discussion that treats this as Aang's fault, and I want to give it a fair hearing before I tell you what I actually think about it. The argument is that the Avatar is the only person who can meaningfully oppose a nation with imperial ambitions, and for a century there wasn't one. Not a bad one, not an ineffective one, just none. Sozin had an entirely open field. He wiped out the air nomads without opposition, and then his son continued the war, and then his grandson continued it after that. And by the time anyone showed up to stop it, there were 3 generations of Fire Nation citizens who had never known peace and genuinely believed they were the good guys. None of that happens if there's an avatar in the world. And the counter-argument, which I find much more persuasive, is that he was 12. He was 12, and the adults responsible for him had just handed him the weight of the entire world, and then removed the one person who made that weight survivable. That is not a decision. That's a child having a very bad night. The show itself, to its credit, does not let him off the hook, and also does not condemn him. It just makes him carry it. There's a moment in book 1 where Aang says out loud that he ran away, and Katara points out he was only 12, and he says it doesn't matter because he ran away when the world needed him. That's the show's actual position. Both things are true. He was a kid, and the world burned, right? Now for the theory that I find genuinely fascinating, because it's the sort of thing that only clicks once you start comparing numbers. Aang dies at 66. For a human being, that's not remarkable. For an avatar, it's strikingly young. Roku made it to 70. Kyoshi, who is the outlier by an absurd margin, made it to 230. Even Kuruk, who we'll get to shortly, and who had an extraordinarily rough time of it, has a specific medical reason for dying early. Aang doesn't have an obvious reason. He wins the war at 12, has a full life, a family, a city named after his ideals, and then he's just gone at an age when most people are thinking about retirement. The widely held fan explanation is that the iceberg did it. The theory is that keeping a body alive and unaged inside a block of ice at the bottom of the sea for that long is not free. The avatar state was running continuously in the background for a century, sustaining him. And the fan reading is that it cost him. Whatever reserve of life an avatar has, he spent a chunk of it lying frozen at the bottom of the ocean, doing nothing at all. There's a bleak elegance to that. The years he skipped weren't skipped, he just paid for them at the other end. I should be honest and say, this one is not confirmed anywhere. It's not in the show, it's not in the comics, and I've never seen a creator go on record with it. But it's tidy, it fits the numbers, and it's the sort of thing that feels true even when you can't prove it. There's also a much stranger consequence of the iceberg that I don't think gets discussed enough, and it's a purely mechanical one. The avatar reincarnates when the avatar dies. That's the entire system. One dies, another is born, the cycle rotates to the next element. It's clockwork. But Aang didn't die, he was frozen. Alive, technically, which meant the cycle simply stopped. For 100 years there was no avatar being born somewhere else, no water tribe child showing signs, nothing. The mechanism was waiting on a signal that never came. So the world didn't lose its avatar. The world had its avatar the entire time. He was just unavailable. And I find that a much more unsettling way to phrase it. Somewhere in the ocean, the whole time Sozin was burning temples, and his son was pushing into the Earth Kingdom, the answer to all of it was sitting there in a ball of ice, breathing very slowly. Since we're on the subject, let's go through what actually happened to the world in the meantime, because the show sprinkles this stuff across 3 seasons, and it's easy to miss how comprehensive it was. The Southern Water Tribe was systematically stripped of waterbenders. The Fire Nation ran raids specifically to remove them, over and over, until there was exactly one left, and she was a little girl who nobody had thought to check. That's Katara. The reason she has to travel to the North Pole to learn her own element is that there is nobody left in her hemisphere who can teach it to her. The Earth Kingdom lost territory continuously for 4 generations. Homashu falls during the show itself. Ba Sing Se holds, but at a cost we'll be getting into at some length later. And the air nomads went from being a living culture to being a museum exhibit, and then to being a punchline. There's a moment in Book 3 where Aang sits in a Fire Nation classroom and hears a teacher explain that the air nomads were an army. That's the version of his people that survived, not a memory, a lie taught to children. The detail that really gets me, though, is smaller than any of that. When Aang wakes up, he keeps asking after people, Boomy, the monks, Kuzon, his friend from the Fire Nation. And the answers are all the same answer, delivered with varying degrees of gentleness, which is that these people are dead and have been dead for decades, and in most cases, their grandchildren are also dead. He's not grieving a war, he's grieving a Tuesday afternoon that was 80 years ago for everyone else and about a week ago for him. Now, since we're already halfway into the spirit world, let's go all the way in. Ko recognizes him. That's the bit. When Aang goes into the spirit world to find the moon and ocean spirits, he ends up in a hollow tree talking to a centipede the size of a bus. And Ko looks at him and says something along the lines of, "My old friend, the Avatar, it's been a long time," casually, like he's commenting on a haircut. And the first time I watched that, I thought it was just spooky flavor text. Creepy spirit says creepy thing to establish that it's very old and very unimpressed by you. It is not flavor text. Ko has met the Avatar before, more than once, and one of those meetings went so badly that the fallout is still radiating outward, centuries later. If you've only watched the show, you get about 90 seconds of this. Aang has to keep his face completely blank or Ko steals it, which is a fantastic bit of horror design for a kid's cartoon, and then he leaves. There's one moment where Ko flashes through his collection of stolen faces, and one of them is a young woman in Water Tribe Blue, and Aang reacts to it, and then the scene moves on. That woman has a name. Her name is Umi, and the story behind her is one of the saddest things in the entire franchise. We got it properly in the novels. F.C. Yi wrote The Rise of Kyoshi in 2019 and The Shadow of Kyoshi in 2020, both in consultation with Michael Dante DiMartino, one of the two people who made the show. So this is not fan speculation. This is canon that happens to live in prose rather than animation, which means a large chunk of the audience has simply never encountered it. Here's the shape of it. Avatar Kuruk came after Yang Chen and before Kyoshi, Water Tribe, and his public reputation in universe was that he was a waste of an avatar, a charming layabout, handsome, popular, spectacularly unbothered, always at a party, never at a crisis. When he died young, the world fell apart almost immediately, and the general consensus was that this was because he'd spent his tenure doing nothing. The reality was that Kuruk spent his entire time as Avatar fighting a war nobody knew about. Dark spirits were crossing into the physical world in numbers, and Kuruk went after them. Alone. Repeatedly. He didn't tell his friends, he didn't tell his teachers, and he didn't tell the world. Partly because he'd inherited the job directly from Yang Chen, who is remembered as basically flawless, and he could not bear to look like he was struggling. And fighting spirits cost something. Every trip across corroded him a bit further. There's a specific term for it in the novels, a spiritual sickness, and it was steadily draining his life force the entire time he was doing the thing that was supposed to be saving everyone. He coped with it exactly the way you'd expect a young man in constant pain and total isolation to cope with it, which is badly, with a great deal of drinking and a great deal of company. And that's the version of him that made it into the history books. He eventually weakened it. He fought and weakened an extremely nasty entity called Father Glowworm, and the incursion stopped, and the spirits made him pay for it. Kuruk was getting married. Umi, a woman from the southern Water Tribe, whom he'd met at a new moon celebration, and fallen for immediately. The ceremony was at the Spirit Oasis, at the North Pole, which is the single most spiritually significant location in the world, and the wedding never happened. Because before it could start, Umi was dragged into the spirit world, and Ko took her face. That's the punishment. Not killing him. Taking her. And here's the part that turns it from tragedy into something closer to a trap. Kuruk went after Ko. Of course he did. He spent the rest of his short life crossing into the spirit world and hunting that thing, and he found it, and he had it, and he couldn't do it. Because Ko doesn't wear stolen faces, he absorbs them. Ummi is part of Ko now. Killing Ko means killing her. Permanently. Whatever's left of her ends when he ends. So the most powerful being in the world stood in front of the thing that had taken his fiancée, determined to destroy it, and had to walk away. And then he did that again, and again. On the anniversary, every year, for the rest of his life, Kuruk travelled to the spirit world to search for Ummi. He died at 33, spiritually drained, physically wrecked, and publicly regarded as the avatar who couldn't be bothered. And because he genuinely spent no time on ordinary human problems, the world he left behind was a mess. The Earth Kingdom destabilized, banditry everywhere, pirate fleets getting bolder. His teachers spent 7 years unable to even find his successor because the usual methods of identifying the next avatar failed completely, which is its own small horror and directly sets up everything that happens to Kyoshi. Now go back and watch the Ko scene with that in your head. It stops being a monster encounter. Aang is a child sitting in front of a spirit that hurt a previous version of him so precisely and so permanently that the wound is still open, and the spirit knows it and Aang doesn't. Ko isn't threatening a stranger. He's needling somebody he's already beaten, in a body that has no memory of the loss. There's a version of this where Ko is just malicious, and there's a version where Ko is doing what Ko does the way a tide does what a tide does, and honestly, I flip between the two. The novels lean towards the second reading. Ko punished Kuruk for arrogance, that's the framing, which is a genuinely alien morality, and I think that's the point. Spirits don't run on human proportionality. One more piece because it links up with something we'll get to much later. Ko has a mother. Her name is the Mother of Faces, and she's the spirit who gives people their identities in the first place. Faces, names, the whole business of being a specific person rather than a general one. Ko is her son, and what he does with faces is a kind of inversion of what she does. And she matters because the mystery that hung over this franchise longer than almost any other, which is what happened to Zuko and Azula's mother, eventually resolves through her. The Mother of Faces has the power to give somebody a new face and a new life. That's the answer. Ursa went to a spirit and asked to stop being herself, which means the same family of spirits that destroyed one avatar's life also gave a Fire Nation woman the only exit she could find from hers. Same power, wildly different outcome. Nobody in the show ever draws the line between those two things out loud. I love that the franchise just leaves it there. No character stands up and points at it. You either notice or you don't. And that brings us to the avatar who came next, who is, and I say this with real affection, possibly the most alarming person ever to hold the job. Avatar Kyoshi founded the Kyoshi Warriors. Avatar Kyoshi also founded the Dai Li. Same woman, same lifetime. One of those groups becomes a beloved order of elite fighters who protect their island and eventually help save the world. The other becomes the secret police of a totalitarian city-state, and the single most sinister organisation in the entire franchise. I don't think there's a better one-sentence summary of what the Avatar actually is than that. Let me take those in order, because the Kyoshi warriors are the easy part. She trained a group of non-benders on her home island to defend themselves without needing an avatar to show up, using her fighting style, her fans, her face paint. Centuries later, Suki is still running that order, and it still works. Genuinely good idea, executed well, still functioning after 400 years. No notes, the Dai Li were also a genuinely good idea. That's the bit people forget. Kyoshi set them up as an elite corps of earthbenders to protect the cultural heritage of Ba Sing Se, guardians of tradition, custodians of the city. It's a sensible thing for an avatar to establish in a place that matters that much. And then she died, and everyone who understood the point of them died, and 2 centuries later, they're brainwashing people in a cave under a lake. There's no dramatic moment where they turn. That's what I find so effective about it. There's no scene where a Daily agent decides to become evil. An institution, built to protect a culture, spent 4 centuries slowly deciding that the biggest threat to that culture was the people living in it. That's not villainy. That's just what institutions do when nobody's watching them, and their founder has been dead for longer than anyone can remember. Now, Kyoshi herself. The novels reframed her fairly dramatically, and the reframe is not flattering in the way fans expected. She grew up poor, genuinely poor, abandoned by her parents, working as a servant. And for years everyone believed the Avatar was somebody else entirely, a charming young man named Yun, who was being trained and paraded around, and treated as the real thing, while Kyoshi carried his bags. Yun was not the Avatar, Kyoshi was, and the discovery of that ruins him in a way the books do not soften. So her formative experience of the role is being overlooked, then being hunted, then learning her element on the run with a group of outlaws. She spends the rise of Kyoshi essentially deciding whether she's going to be an avatar or a vigilante. And the honest answer the book arrives at is that she doesn't fully choose. She becomes both. Which brings us to the line. In the show, in Book 2, Aang is on trial for a crime Kyoshi committed centuries earlier. The people of a town called Qin believe the Avatar murdered their leader, Qin the Conqueror. Aang, being Aang, insists that no Avatar would ever do such a thing, and then Kyoshi shows up inside his own head to correct him. She explains that Qin was a warlord expanding across the Earth Kingdom and that she confronted him on a cliff edge. She used earthbending to separate the peninsula she was standing on from the mainland. Qin refused to move, the ground gave way, and he fell. And then she says it. She says she didn't kill him technically, but that she's not going to pretend she isn't responsible either. Aang is horrified. The audience is meant to be a little horrified. But sit with it, and it's the most honest thing any Avatar says in the entire series. Kyoshi is not claiming innocence, and she is not performing guilt. She did a thing that had a foreseeable outcome. The outcome happened. And she has spent several centuries entirely at peace with it. That peninsula, by the way, is Kyoshi Island. She made an island by getting annoyed at a man. I think about that more than I should. 230 years that reign. Longest in recorded Avatar history. And the novels are quite clear that this was not a blessing. She outlived her teachers. She outlived her friends. She outlived the people who knew her before she was the Avatar. And then she outlived the people who knew those people. And by the end she was a living monument who had personally met historical figures that everyone else read about in books. The last of her original circle to go was Rangi, and the books do not linger on it, which somehow makes it worse. There's a fan theory in this space that I think is the most interesting argument in the whole franchise, and it doesn't have a clean answer. The theory is simply this: Kyoshi's approach worked better than Aang's. The argument runs like this: Kyoshi was decisive, occasionally lethal, and completely unbothered by the optics of it, and the era after her was, by the standards of this world, remarkably stable. Long stretches of peace, firm borders, warlords who did not fancy their chances, whereas the Avatars, who tried to be gentle about it, produced mixed results at best. Roku refused to kill his childhood friend Sosin when he had the chance, and every single thing in this video flows out of that decision. Aang refuses to kill Ozai, and the show has to invent an entirely new form of bending in the final hour to get him out of it, which we'll be arguing about later at some length. And Kuruk tried to solve everything privately and quietly, and it killed him at 33. Now, I don't actually think the franchise agrees with the Kyoshi reading. I think the franchise is much more interested in the idea that the violent solution buys you a shorter piece than it looks like it does, and the Dai Li are the proof of that, sitting right there in her own biography. She built a knife and handed it to a city, but I do think the franchise refuses to close the argument, and that's why people are still at it. Aang and Kyoshi are both presented as correct. Neither is punished. Neither is vindicated. My honest opinion, and you can disagree with me freely here, is that Kyoshi is the most competent avatar we've been shown, and the one I would least like to have a conversation with. There's a coldness to her in the books that the show only hints at. She is extremely good at the job, and she has stopped being especially bothered about people as individuals, which is possibly what 2 centuries does to you. One last detail on her, and it's a small one that I find quite funny. The Kyoshi warriors wear her makeup. The full kabuki face, the red eyeshadow, the whole thing. Everyone assumes it's ceremonial, a way of honouring her. In the novels she wore it partly because she was enormously tall and physically imposing and had spent her childhood being invisible, and the face paint was a way of making absolutely certain that when she walked into a room, the room knew. It wasn't reverence. It was a very tall woman deciding she was done being overlooked. 400 years later, there's an entire warrior order doing her intimidation tactic as a uniform. And not one of them knows that's what it was, which is a good excuse to talk about what her guardians of culture eventually turned into, and the city they turned into it inside. Ba Sing Se looks lovely. That's the first thing. It's green. There are trees. The tea is famously excellent. People are smiling. There's a monorail. After 2 seasons of ash and warships and refugee camps, Team Avatar arrives at the Great Walled City, and it is, visually, the most pleasant place we've seen. And it takes about 20 minutes for the skin to start crawling. The city works in rings, outer, middle, inner. Where you live is determined by what you are, and there's no meaningful movement between them. Refugees pile into the lower ring, where the war has driven everyone who has lost everything. The middle ring is the bureaucrats and the shopkeepers. The upper ring is old money and the palace. The Earth King lives in the inner ring, and the Earth King is a figurehead. He has a bear. He is quite happy. He has, at the point Team Avatar arrives, no functional idea that there is a war on at all, because the entire apparatus of his government has decided he doesn't need to know, and has been maintaining that arrangement for a long time. Real power sits with a man called Long Feng, whose official title is Grand Secretariat and head of the Dai Li, and whose actual job is running the city and managing the Earth King the way you'd manage a pet. And the rule, the one the internet has never let go of, is that there is no war in Ba Sing Se. Not there is a war, and we would rather not discuss it. There is no war. You are to say, there is no war. If you say otherwise, you will be corrected. And if you keep saying otherwise, you will be dealt with. Which brings us to Judy. Judy is the cheerful woman assigned to guide Team Avatar around the city. She smiles constantly. She answers questions that were not asked. She deflects the ones that were. And every time somebody mentions the war, her face does something very slightly wrong before she gets it back under control. Then she disappears, and a different woman arrives, and she's also called Judy, and she behaves identically, and everyone acts as though nothing has happened. Judy is not a person. Judy is a role, and there are a supply of women available to fill it. And when one of them stops functioning correctly, she is removed and replaced, and the name transfers. That's genuinely one of the most chilling ideas I've encountered in children's television, and the show delivers it with no music sting at all. It just happens, and you either notice or you don't. Now, the lake. Lake Laogai is a facility underneath a lake, outside the city, where the Dai Li take people who have become inconvenient. Not to imprison them, to fix them. The process involves a spinning lamp, a repeated phrase, and a great deal of time. The phrase is the one about there being no war. They repeat it until the person's own memory rearranges itself around it, and then they put them back into the city, functional and pleasant and no longer a problem. That's what happened to Judy, all of them. And the name is not an accident. Laogai was the name of the Chinese system of penal labour camps, where the stated purpose was reform through labour, re-education. That's a real system. It ran for decades, and the show borrowed the name directly and put it on the wall of a cave where a secret police force performs psychological conditioning on civilians. I still find it slightly hard to believe this aired on a channel that also ran SpongeBob, which brings us to Jet and to the bit of production history that sits underneath his last scene. Jet turns up first in Book 1 as a charismatic teenage rebel with a group called the Freedom Fighters, and he's introduced as the coolest person Katara has ever met, and revealed within one episode as somebody willing to drown a village full of civilians to get at a Fire Nation garrison. Katara calls him a monster. He is at that point about 16. He comes back in Book 2, having genuinely tried to change. He's given up the swords, he's living in Ba Sing Se, he's attempting, in a fairly clumsy way, to be a better person. And then he recognises Zuko and Iroh, tries to expose them, gets picked up by the Dai Li, gets taken to Lake Laogai, and comes out of it brainwashed. Team Avatar breaks the conditioning. Jet helps them. Long Feng earth bends at him, and then there's a shot of Jet lying on the ground and the dust settling, and nobody uses the word. Katara tries to heal him and can't. Jet tells them to go on without him. Toph, who can hear heartbeats through the floor, says nothing while the others are talking, and then quietly tells Sokka afterwards that he's lying. That's how you find out. A blind girl declines to correct a lie, and the show moves on. The reason it's staged that way is that Nickelodeon would not let them show it. DiMartino and Konietzko explain this later on a DVD commentary, and the specific objection was partly that Jet was still a child himself. You can have a war, you can have a genocide in the backstory, you can have a lake full of brainwashing. You cannot show a teenager dying on screen at 4:30 in the afternoon. And the thing I genuinely admire is that the restriction made the scene better. There is no version of that moment with an explicit death that lands harder than Toph declining to say anything. The show then, a full season later, makes a joke about it. In the Ember Island Players, the gang watch a stage version of their own adventures, and the play stages Jet's death. And Zuko, who wasn't there, leans over and asks whether Jet actually died, and Sokka says it was unclear. That's the show winking at its own censorship in front of the entire audience. And I think it's one of the funniest things in the series precisely because it's so bleak. Right, one more thread on Ba Sing Se, and it's the one that stops this from being a self-contained horror story. The city never gets fixed. Azula takes the Dai Li off Long Feng in about a fortnight, essentially by being more frightening than he is, and uses them to stage a coup. After the war, the Earth Kingdom spends the comics in a state of ongoing instability, and then in The Legend of Korra, 70 years later, the Dai Li are still there. Still operating, still working for whoever is currently sitting in the palace, an organisation founded to protect a culture, corrupted into a tool for controlling it, then handed to a foreign teenager, then handed back, and it just keeps running. Nobody ever dissolves it. Nobody ever seriously tries. I think that's the darkest thing in the whole Ba Sing Se arc, and it isn't a theory, it's just what happens. The heroes win, the war ends, the Avatar restores balance to the world, and the secret police under the lake carry on regardless, because they were never really the war's problem. They were the cities. But now, let's talk a little about the single darkest technique in the entire franchise, and the woman who worked it out. Before Harma is anything else, Harma is an old woman running an inn. That's how the episode introduces her. Team Avatar are in the Fire Nation, undercover, and they end up in a village where people have been vanishing under the full moon. And there's a friendly old lady who invites them to stay and cooks them dinner and takes an interest in Katara. And she's Southern Water Tribe, which means she's the first person Katara has ever met, outside her own family, who comes from where she comes from. The episode gives you a genuinely lovely stretch, where the two of them cook together, and Hammer teaches her tribal techniques she's never seen. And Katara is visibly happy in a way she almost never is. and if you don't know where this is going, it plays as one of the warmest sequences in the season. Harmer came from somewhere specific. The Fire Nation understood early that waterbenders were a strategic problem, and they solved it with raids, not on the north, which was fortified and remote, but on the south. They came repeatedly, over decades, and each time they took the waterbenders away. Not killed, taken. And they kept coming back until there weren't any left. Harmer was one of the last. She fought, she lost, and she was put in a facility purpose-built for people like her, which meant it was designed around a single principle. No water, dry cells, dry air, nothing to reach for. They understood exactly what she was, and they built a box that made it irrelevant. She was in there for decades, and in there with nothing else to occupy her. She worked out something that nobody in the history of the world had worked out. Living things are mostly water. The guards walking past her cell were, functionally, walking bodies of water with legs. Under a full moon, when a waterbender's power peaks, she could reach into one of them and take control of it directly. She practiced on rats first, then on a guard, and then she walked out. I want to sit with that for a second, because the show does not, and I think it's the most impressive act of will in the entire franchise. She invented a new discipline of bending from scratch, alone, in a cell, with no teacher and no materials, powered entirely by wanting to get out. If literally anyone else had done that, it would be an origin story. What she did with it afterwards is the problem. Harmer did not go home. She stayed in the Fire Nation, settled in a village, ran an inn, and once a month, under the full moon, she took people. Ordinary villagers. Not soldiers, not officials, people who happened to live there. She kept them alive in a cave in a mountain in chains for years, and the episode shows us those people, and they are in a very bad way. So the show wants you to arrive at a specific place, and the place is that Harmer was wronged catastrophically and has become something monstrous, and that both of these things are entirely true at once. There's a strand of fan discussion that pushes harder than that and argues that the show is unfair to her. The argument goes that Harmer is the last survivor of a campaign of ethnic cleansing, that the nation which carried it out has faced no consequences whatsoever, that every adult in that village is a citizen of that nation who has spent their life benefiting from it, and that Katara, who has lost far less, gets to lecture her about it. I don't fully buy it, and I'll tell you why. The people in that cave weren't the people who took her. It's decades later. Some of them weren't born. And the specific thing that makes Harmer a villain in the episode isn't the revenge. It's that she enjoys it, and that she tries to hand it to Katara like an inheritance. But I don't think the argument is stupid either. And I notice that the episode is careful not to give her a comeuppance that feels satisfying. She's taken away in chains at the end, laughing, having successfully forced Katara to bloodbend to stop her. That's her actual victory. She loses the fight and wins the point. Katara does eventually use it again, once against a man called Yon Ra, the officer who killed her mother. She goes looking for him in Book 3, finds him, and holds him there, and then doesn't do it. She lets him go, not because he deserves it, which the episode is explicit about, but because she doesn't want to be the person who did. And then much later in her life, she testifies to have it outlawed. It becomes illegal. Not discouraged, not frowned upon. Illegal by name in the legal code of the United Republic because of her, which does not work, obviously. The legend of Korra picks this up and runs it somewhere genuinely unpleasant. There's a crime boss called Yakone who can bloodbend without a full moon. That's the escalation. The single limitation on the technique, the one thing that made it survivable, was that you needed the moon, and Yakone simply doesn't. He does it in a courtroom in daylight, to an entire room of people, including the Avatar. Aang has to take his bending away to stop him, which is its own can of worms that we'll get to. And then Yakone's sons carry it forward, and one of them becomes a councilman called Tarlok, who uses it as a political tool, and the other one puts on a mask, calls himself Amun, and builds a mass movement out of the idea that bending itself is the problem. He strips people's bending permanently. It's presented as a spiritual technique. It is, underneath, an extremely refined application of a thing an old woman worked out in a cell. There's a neat, horrible symmetry to it. The technique was invented by a victim of oppression to escape, and within 2 generations, it's being used by a man in a mask to remove people's ability to defend themselves. One fun detail before we move on, because this section is a bit heavy. The episode is called The Puppet Master, and it's the only outright horror episode the show ever made. Fog, a haunted mountain, missing villagers, a creepy old woman. It aired on a Friday in November, and the production team knew exactly what they were doing with it. Katara doesn't get a triumph, Aang barely features, and the last shot is her on her knees, having just done the thing she swore she wouldn't. No notes, honestly. It's a perfect episode, and I don't especially want to watch it again. Since we're on the subject of people the show would quite like you to hate, let's talk about Azula. My own mother thought I was a monster. That's the line. She says it at the end of a beach episode, of all places sitting round a fire with 3 teenagers doing a group therapy session they did not sign up for, and she says it flatly, as a fact, and then immediately adds that she was right. So it doesn't really matter. She's 14. I think a lot of people watched this show as children and understood Azula as the scary one, and then re-watched it as adults and had a fairly uncomfortable time. Here's the reframe, and it's less a theory than a reading that becomes hard to avoid once you've seen it. Azula was not born like this. Azula was made deliberately by an adult, starting when she was extremely small. Ozai identified early that his daughter was gifted and his son was not, and he responded by investing in one and discarding the other. Azula was praised, promoted, given access, told she was the true heir, and the thing she was praised for consistently was being ruthless. Not being clever, not being disciplined, being willing to do the thing that other people wouldn't. That's the entire feedback loop of her childhood. Be frightening, receive love. Be anything else, receive nothing. So by the time we meet her at 14, she's got a fully formed method. She reads people extremely accurately, identifies the thing they're most afraid of, and uses it. She does it to Zuko constantly. She does it to Long Feng, an adult who has run a city for years and takes his organisation off him in about a fortnight. She does it to her own friends, who are not friends, and she knows they're not friends, and she says so. And the show is quite careful to let you see the cost of it in small moments before the big collapse. There's a scene where she attempts to flirt with a boy, and it is genuinely painful to watch, because she has no idea how to be a person when frightening people isn't the goal. She's not being funny about it. She's trying. The blue fire is the detail everyone latches onto, and I think the popular reading of it is correct. Blue flame burns hotter and cleaner than orange, and that's real physics, not just a colour choice. Fans read it as the physical signature of somebody who has organised her entire self around precision and superiority, and the show supports that reading in the way it's animated. Azula's firebending is exact. Nothing is wasted. Her lightning is the best in the series. And precision is a brittle thing to build a personality out of, because the moment you're not perfect, you have nothing else, which is exactly how she comes apart. The final stretch of the series, when Sozin's comet is overhead, is mostly action, except for Azula's storyline, which is not action at all. It's a slow-motion breakdown. It starts when Mai and Ty Lee turn on her at the boiling rock. That's the load-bearing beam. She had built a model of the world in which fear was reliable and affection was not, and then 2 people who were afraid of her chose somebody else anyway. Mai's line about loving Zuko more than she fears Azula is aimed exactly at the thing Azula cannot process. After that, it's a series of increasingly small things. She banishes the servants, then the guards, then everyone. Her father, who has never loved her, leaves her behind on the biggest day in her nation's history and hands her a title instead, and she takes the title as though it means something, and it visibly doesn't. Then she cuts her own hair, badly, in front of a mirror, and sees her mother in the reflection. And that scene is not played for horror. That's what I find so striking about it. Yrsa, in the hallucination, is gentle. She tells her daughter she loves her, and Azula screams at her and throws the hairbrush at the mirror and shatters it. She loses the final fight not because Zuko outfights her, but because she is by that point unable to hold a strategy together for 30 seconds. And the last we see of her in the series is on the ground, chained, weeping, unable to stop. There's a fair amount of fan discussion trying to put a name to what happens to her, and you'll see everything proposed, from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder to antisocial personality disorder. I want to be really clear that these are fan readings, not diagnoses. The show never names anything. The creators have never named anything. And a fictional teenager in a fantasy world isn't a case study. What the show depicts is a psychotic break in a 14-year-old, drawn for a children's network, and I think it's better to leave it at that than to slap a label on it. The franchise, to its credit, has refused to close her story. The comics pick her up. In Smoke and Shadow, she's out of the institution and operating on her own terms, and she's genuinely frightening again, but she's also, fairly clearly, still unwell and being manipulative in ways that read as self-protective. And then there's a later comic, Azula in the Spirit Temple, which is exactly what it sounds like, and which is largely about her having to confront versions of herself. She never gets a redemption arc. She never gets a happy ending. She also never gets written off, which I think is the right call. The idea that a 14-year-old raised by that man could be repaired in one story arc would have been an insult. And my honest opinion, for what it's worth, is that Azula's ending is the least satisfying thing in the finale and the most realistic. Everybody else gets a resolution. Zuko gets the throne. Aang gets the world. Azula ends up in a mental institution and remains an open question. Right. One contrast, and then we'll move on, because it's the thing that makes all of the above land properly. Zuko's scar. The scar is not a war wound. It happened in a room in front of an audience of court officials when he was 13. He spoke out of turn in a war meeting, objecting to a plan that involved sacrificing an entire division of new recruits as bait. He was correct. He was also 13 and had spoken in a room where speaking was not permitted, so he was required to duel for his honour, and the person he had actually offended was his father, so the person he had to duel was his father. He refused to fight. He knelt down and begged, and Ozai burned his son's face in front of the court, and then banished him with an impossible task attached. Same parent, that's what I keep coming back to. Ozai looked at his 2 children, and burned one and armed the other, and the show is quite clear that these are the same act performed with different tools. And here's a detail about the Fire Nation itself that I think about more than I should. There's an episode in Book 3 where Aang goes undercover as a Fire Nation schoolboy, and it's mostly a light episode. He gets in trouble, he organises a secret dance party, there's a headband. Very fun. And in the middle of it, he sits in a history lesson. The teacher explains that the air nomads were an army. Not a people, an army. Air nomad monks, peaceful and unorganised, were defeated in a great victory by Fire Lord Sozin. Aang, who is sitting at the back of the classroom, is the only person alive who knows that's not true. The children around him are not being lied to in any way they could detect. They're being taught out of a textbook by an adult who presumably believes it herself, because she was taught it out of a textbook by an adult who believed it too. That's 3 generations deep by this point. A genocide reframed as a curriculum. And the horrible efficiency of it is that it isn't even a difficult lie to maintain because there's nobody left to contradict it. You can only fact-check the extermination of a people if some of them survived. That's the thing about the Fire Nation that I don't think the show gets enough credit for. It is not run on fear, it's run on belief. The soldiers we meet mostly aren't sadists. The civilians are ordinary. There's an entire episode built around Zuko living quietly in an Earth Kingdom village. And the running theme is that these are all just people. The Fire Nation isn't a nation of monsters who happen to win. It's a nation of reasonably normal people who have been told a very consistent story for 3 generations about how they are sharing their prosperity with the world. Their popular entertainment tells the same story, which brings us to the Ember Island Players. The play The Gang Watch is a state-approved dramatisation of their own adventures, and it's a fantastic bit of comedy that hides something quite pointed. It's a propaganda piece. It portrays Aang as a hyperactive idiot, Katara as weepy, Sokka as a fool, Zuko as a whiner, and it ends with the Fire Lord winning and the Avatar dying. That's the version of current events playing to sold-out houses in a Fire Nation resort town in the final weeks of the war. Not a warning, a comedy. The audience laughs and goes home. Zuko watches his own death scene surrounded by people applauding it. Aang walks out. Now, Sozin's comet as a weapon. We've established what it did the first time. What I want to look at is what Ozai was planning to do with the second pass, because it's the thing that quietly makes him the worst person in the franchise, and the show almost throws it away. Ozai's plan was not to conquer the Earth Kingdom. The Fire Nation had been trying that for a century and had largely got there anyway. His plan, once he understood that resistance was still possible, was to fly over the Earth Kingdom in an airship fleet with the comet overhead and burn it. All of it. Land, cities, people, the lot. Scorch the continent flat and build something new on the ash. He announces this to a room, and the room agrees with him, and then he gives himself a new title. That's a second genocide, planned openly by a head of state, in front of his own government, and nobody in the room objects. The only person who ever objects to anything in that room is a 16-year-old, and we know how that went. The show does not dwell on it. It's introduced fairly late, and functions mostly as a ticking clock. But the scale of what Ozai intended is genuinely enormous, and it recontextualizes the finale. Aang isn't stopping a conqueror, he's stopping an extinction event with a schedule. There's a broader reading of the Fire Nation that comes up constantly, which is that it's the Second World War with the serial numbers filed off. Expansionist island empire, industrial military, imperial family, a war of conquest across a continent, ending with a superweapon. And it's the obvious analogue, it's clearly in there. But I think the one-to-one map falls apart if you push on it, and the show is drawing from more than one place. The industrial imagery, in particular, reads much more like the British and European empires of the 19th century. The drill at Ba Sing Se is a piece of colonial engineering. The factory in The Painted Lady, which is poisoning a river, and the village downstream of it, and has been for years, is a straightforward industrial pollution story. And the villagers are too poor and too frightened to do anything about it. The fleets, the coal, the machines. That's not a 1940s image, that's an 1880s one. And the air nomads being wiped out by a technologically superior neighbour who then rewrote their history as a military threat is a pattern with a great many real-world versions, and no single one that fits neatly. So I'd say it's a composite, and I'd say the composite is more useful than the straight analogue, because it means the show isn't asking you to spot a reference, it's asking you to recognise a shape. One last thought on this, and it's the thing I find genuinely strange about Book 3. The most rewatchable episode in that season is a beach episode. Zuko, Azula, Mai and Ty Lee on holiday, being bored and awful to each other. It's very funny, it's beautifully written, and it's about 4 teenagers from the ruling class of an empire having a miserable weekend because none of them know how to talk to anyone. And the fact that it works, that you sit there enjoying the company of Ozai's children while they complain about a party, is I think the whole trick the Fire Nation pulls on the audience. You spend 2 seasons being told they're the enemy, and then you spend a season living with them, and by the end you like most of them. And they are still the citizens of the nation that did all of it. Which leads pretty naturally into the ending, and the thing fans have been arguing about since 2008. Right, the complaint. Let me state it fairly because it's the most common criticism the show gets, and it deserves better than a dismissal. Across the final 4-part finale, Aang has a problem. The Fire Lord has to be stopped. Everyone agrees he has to be stopped, and every practical route to stopping him ends with him dead. Aang is an air nomad and will not kill. He goes to his past lives for guidance, one at a time, and every single one of them tells him to do it. Roku, Kyoshi, Kuruk, Yang Chen, 4 for 4. He refuses anyway. And then, on the night before the comet, he falls asleep on a beach and wakes up on an island that was not there before. And on the island is an enormous lion turtle. And the lion turtle teaches him a form of bending nobody has mentioned once in 60 episodes, which allows him to remove Ozai's firebending permanently without harming him. Problem solved. Roll credits. And a lot of people, at the time and since, went, hang on, the charge is that this is a deus ex machina in the most literal available sense. A god shows up out of the sea and fixes the protagonist's moral dilemma, so he doesn't have to make a choice. The show spends the entire season building an impossible decision and then declines to make him decide. Now here's the defense, and it's better than it looks. The lion turtles are not invented for that scene. They're seeded. There's a passing mention earlier in the series, and more importantly, when the legend of Korra eventually shows us the origin of bending itself, the lion turtles are at the center of it. In the world's deep past, humans lived on the backs of lion turtles, and the lion turtles granted them the ability to bend an element temporarily so they could survive on the ground, and then took it back when they returned. Energy bending isn't a new technique, it's the original one. Bending as we know it, the elemental version, is the downstream product. The lion turtle isn't giving Aang a new power, it's giving him the old one. So the mythology holds up retroactively and completely. What doesn't hold up is the timing, and I think that's the honest position. The idea is sound, and the delivery is about 4 episodes too late. If the lion turtle had turned up at the start of the finale instead of 2/3 of the way through it, almost nobody would complain. Now the theory I actually find interesting in this space is a much colder one, and it goes like this. Energy bending is worse than killing him. Ozai does not die. Ozai spends the rest of his life alive, in a cell, powerless, and entirely aware of what he lost. He was the most powerful firebender in the world, and the sovereign of the most powerful nation, and now he is a man in a room. His son runs the country, his daughter is institutionalized, his war is over, and the world is being rebuilt specifically to make sure nothing like him happens again. And he gets to watch all of it, for decades. If you'd asked Kyoshi, she'd have dropped him off a cliff and gone home for tea. That's a cleaner outcome for Ozai than what he actually got. And there's something genuinely uncomfortable in that, because the show frames the ending as Aang finding the merciful third option, and it's not obvious to me that it is one. Which brings me to Yang Chen, who is my favourite thing in this entire argument. When Aang consults his past lives, 3 of them tell him roughly what you'd expect. Roku says he was too soft on Sozin, and it cost the world everything. Aang gives her the line about not killing Chin technically. Kuruk tells him to be aggressive, and then Aang goes to Yang Chen, and Yang Chen is the one he's counting on. She's the air nomad. She's the previous airbender avatar, the one who shares his spiritual tradition, the one who by rights should back him up. And she tells him he's wrong. She says that the air nomads detach themselves from the world so they can achieve spiritual enlightenment, and that the avatar cannot do that, because the avatar's duty is to the world. She says that selfless duty means sacrificing your own spiritual needs. That's the most spiritually accomplished avatar we know of, telling a 12-year-old that being good is not the job. And it's put in her mouth precisely because it's the last place he'd expect to hear it. The show then has him ignore her and gives him a giant turtle and lets him win. I go back and forth on this. My honest position, and you're welcome to disagree, is that Yang Chen is right about the principle, and Aang is right about himself. The avatar's duty is to the world, absolutely. But an Aang who kills Ozai is not an Aang who then spends 40 years building a city where 4 nations live together. The thing that made him useful afterwards is the same thing that made him difficult during. You don't get one without the other, which is a nice thought, and it gets significantly complicated by what we find out about the rest of his life, because Aang was not a great father. The legend of Korra reveals this quietly, mostly through his children, and it's one of the more surprising things the sequel does. He had 3, Bumi, a non-bender, Kaya, a waterbender, and Tenzin, an airbender, and he was, by their own accounts, effectively a full-time father to one of them. It's not framed as cruelty, it's framed as a man with a mission. Aang was the last airbender, and he was trying to bring an entire culture back from nothing, and Tenzin was the only person on the planet who could carry it. So Tenzin got the training, and the temples and the attention, and Bumi and Kaya got a father who was busy. Kaya says it plainly at one point. Bumi is more bitter about it than he lets on, and there's a real sting in the fact that the man whose defining wound is losing his people ended up building his family around replacing them. And that, I think, is a better dark theory than most of the actual dark theories, because it's not a theory. It's just there in the text, unresolved. The show does not condemn him for it, and does not excuse him. It just says, this happened and his children noticed. And that whole question of what the job costs gets a much bleaker second draft in Korra. Every avatar before Korra is gone. Not unavailable, not sulking. Gone. Kyoshi, Roku, Kuruk, Yang Chen, Aang, and every single one before them, going back thousands of years, permanently severed. That happened on screen in Season 2, and I still don't think the fandom has fully absorbed it. The mechanism is worth walking through. Korra's uncle, Unalaq, spends the season working towards an event called harmonic convergence, which happens once every 10,000 years and thins the barrier between the physical and spirit worlds. His goal is to free a spirit called Vatu, the spirit of chaos and darkness, and merge with it, becoming a dark avatar. And in the process of fighting him, Korra loses the connection. Vatu destroys Rava, the light spirit bonded to the avatar, permanently severing Korra's connection to the accumulated avatar line. All of it. She has to rebuild the bond from scratch afterwards, and she does, but the past lives don't come back. So Korra is functionally the first avatar of a brand new cycle. 10,000 years of accumulated experience, every past life she could have asked for advice, every one of the 4 voices Aang consulted before the finale, deleted, and the thing that gets me about it is that it's the loss of a support system, not a weapon. Aang was a 12-year-old who could go and ask Yang Chen a question. Korra can't ask anyone anything. She's on her own in a way no avatar has been since the very first one. Season 3 does something else to her entirely. Zahir and the Red Lotus are, I'd argue, the best antagonists the franchise produced, partly because their position is coherent. They believe the Avatar is an unelected authority figure, that the world has organized itself around, and that the world would be freer without one. They're not wrong about the premise, they're just willing to do absolutely anything about it. They capture Korra and poison her with mercury, specifically to force her into the avatar state so they can kill her in it, which would end the cycle permanently rather than just moving it along. She survives, barely, and then the show does something I genuinely did not expect a network cartoon to do, which is spend the next season on the aftermath. Korra is in a wheelchair. She can't fight. The mercury is still in her body, and it takes a long time to get out. She has flashbacks. She hallucinates a version of herself, in the avatar state, chained, following her around. She leaves entirely and goes off on her own, tells nobody where she is and spends 2 years failing to get better. That's an action hero in a children's franchise, unable to be an action hero for an entire season, with the show refusing to speed it up. I have a lot of time for that. It's a slow, unglamorous recovery arc in a genre that has no patience for those. And the thing that eventually helps is not a spiritual breakthrough, it's Toph telling her bluntly that she's still carrying the metal in her body because part of her doesn't want to let it go. Right, one thing from that same season that I want to flag, because it connects directly back to where we started tonight. Zahir is an airbender, and in the back half of season 3, he kills the Earth Queen by taking the air out of her lungs. On screen, deliberately. It's slow and it's quiet, and it's one of the most upsetting things in either series, which is the technique fans have argued for decades that Gyatso used in that temple. Same discipline, opposite purpose, roughly 170 years apart. The franchise never connects the two out loud. It just does it in front of you and moves on. Now, the deepest reading in the Korra material, and the one that reframes the entire franchise, if you let it. Rava and Vaatu are two halves of the same cosmic balance, permanently in conflict, and they have been for at least 10,000 years. The Avatar exists because a man called Wan fused himself with Rava 10,000 years ago to keep Vaatu contained. So the theory, and it's a fairly popular one, is that the Avatar was never a gift. It's a containment measure. Every Avatar is a human being used as a vessel to hold one half of a cosmic argument in place. And the reincarnation cycle isn't a blessing, it's a maintenance schedule. When one host wears out, another is issued. Nobody consents to it. Nobody is asked. You are born, and at some point somebody tells you what you are, and that's that. Aang ran. Korra spent her childhood being trained in a compound. Kyoshi found out by accident, after years of being the wrong person's servant. The one thing they all have in common is that none of them applied. And under that reading, everything we've talked about tonight looks slightly different. Kuruk being drained by spirit sickness, Aang losing a century, Korra losing every predecessor, and then 2 years of her life to poison. Those aren't a run of bad luck. They're the operating cost of a system that uses people up, which is exactly where the franchise is heading next. And this is the part that made me sit up. Avatar: Seven Havens was announced in February 2025 and premieres on Paramount Plus on the 9th of October 2026. It's from Di Martino and Konietzko, 26 episodes across 2 books, and it's set well after Korra in a world that has been broken by some kind of cataclysm. The new Avatar is an earthbender called Pavi, and the official logline for the series says that, in this era, being the Avatar marks her as humanity's destroyer rather than its saviour. She's hunted by humans and by spirits, and she has a long-lost twin, and the survivors of the world are living in 7 strongholds that are running out of time. So the franchise that spent 2 decades asking what the Avatar costs the person holding the title is now asking what the Avatar costs everyone else. That's the darkest reading of its own premise, made canon by the people who wrote the original. I find that genuinely fascinating and slightly funny in the way that a creator going back to make their own mythology worse is always slightly funny. They had a perfectly nice story about balance, and they've spent 2 decades quietly turning it into a story about a burden nobody can put down. There's a last piece to this that isn't a theory at all, and I'd like to end the heavy material on it. There's an episode in Book 2 called The Tales of Ba Sing Se. It's an anthology, 6 short stories, each focusing on different main characters and groups, running about 3 or 4 minutes each. Katara and Toph have a day out. Sokka accidentally joins a poetry club. Momo goes looking for Appa. And there's one about Iroh. The tale of Iroh is about 4 minutes long and has almost no plot. Iroh walks around the city buying things. He helps a child with a broken toy. He calms a crying baby by singing to it. He talks a would-be mugger out of it by critiquing his stance, and then buying him tea and giving him career advice. He tends to a moonflower, gently sliding it into the shade so it can bloom. And then he goes and sits under a tree and sets out the picnic he's been assembling all day and puts a portrait in front of it. And it turns out the whole thing was preparation for the birthday of his son. Lu Ten died at Ba Sing Se years earlier in the siege Iroh himself was leading. That's the reason Iroh walked away from the war and the throne and everything else. And the show has mentioned it before, briefly, but this is the first time we see him with it. And he sings. It's a very short song, 4 lines, about a soldier boy coming home, and Mako's voice cracks on it. And then he apologizes to a portrait for not being able to help him. The segment ends with a dedication in honor of Mako. Mako Iwamatsu voiced Iroh for the first 2 seasons of the show. He was Japanese-born and American-raised, and he'd had a long and extremely serious career before he ever went near a cartoon. He was nominated for an Academy Award for The Sand Pebbles in 1966 and for a Tony. He co-founded East West Players, a theatre company set up specifically to give Asian American actors work and roles at a time when there was very little of either. He was also, and I love that these are the same man, the voice of Aku in Samurai Jack. He died of esophageal cancer on the 21st of July 2006, aged 72. He'd finished his lines for Book 2 shortly before, so the tale of Iroh is one of the last things he recorded as the character, and it's a 4-minute short about a man grieving a son. Nobody planned that. That's just how it landed. Greg Baldwin took over for Book 3. He wasn't a stranger to it. He'd been Mako's voice double for years, re-recording lines and covering additional dialogue whenever Mako wasn't available, which is why the change is so much less jarring than it had any right to be. He's played Iroh ever since. He played him in Korra, he inherited Aku as well, and he will not sing that song. People ask him at conventions constantly, and he turns it down every single time. His stated reason is that it's Mako's song, and not his. He has been doing the voice for 2 decades, and he has never once done the 4 lines. I think that's about the classiest thing I've heard from anyone in this industry. Right, the rest of the production history is a bit less graceful. In 2010, there was a live-action film directed by M. Night Shyamalan, and I'm not going to spend long on it because everyone who cares already has an opinion. What's worth noting is that the casting decisions, in particular putting white actors in the leads of a story built entirely from Asian and Inuit cultures, kicked off a campaign that the fandom has never really let go of. It genuinely changed how a chunk of the audience talks about adaptation. That conversation started there. Then Netflix. DiMartino and Konietzko signed on in 2018 as executive producers and showrunners on a live-action series, spent 2 years developing it, and walked away in June of 2020. Their public explanation in a letter from DiMartino and an Instagram post from Konietzko was that they'd been promised creative control and hadn't got it. Konietzko's phrasing was that there was no follow-through on the promise. the show got made anyway. It's had 2 seasons now, and season 2 landed in 2026 to a fairly sharp drop in viewership from the first, which promptly revived the whole argument about their exit all over again. There's a co-executive producer on record explaining that some of the cuts were production reality rather than choice, including that they couldn't fit the drill in and that the Earth King's bear was removed because the visual effects cost too much, which is, I have to say, a very funny sentence. There's also what happened to Korra itself, which is that Nickelodeon pulled it off the broadcast schedule partway through and shifted the remainder of the run online. A sequel to one of the most acclaimed animated shows the network ever produced, finishing its life on the internet because the ratings weren't where they wanted them. And then there's 2026, which has been a genuine mess. Avatar Studios was set up in 2021, with the 2 of them running it. And the first project was a feature film following the original cast into young adulthood. It was originally due in theatres in October 2025. Then it moved. Then it moved again. Then the wide theatrical release was scrapped and it became a Paramount Plus streaming launch with only a 1-week limited theatrical run in New York and Los Angeles. And then the whole film was stolen and leaked online months before release. Paramount's response was to keep the premiere back rather than move it forward. So it's now due out in theatres on the 9th of October 2026. It's called Avatar Aang, The Last Airbender. And the vast majority of the people who wanted to see it on a big screen never got to. So that's the shape of it. A franchise about reincarnation, made by people who don't get to reincarnate. The characters stay exactly as they were. Iroh will always be sitting under that tree, but the man who gave him that voice has been gone a very long time, and his understudy still won't sing the song, and the 2 people who built the whole thing have spent 2 decades fighting studios over how it gets adapted. There's no theory in that, it's just what happened. And I think it's more affecting than most of the theories, because the theories are all about a fictional world that can absorb any amount of darkness and carry on. The production history is about actual people, and it doesn't reset. Somewhere under the desert, there is a building full of everything, and it is under the desert because of us. Wan Shetong is a spirit who takes the form of an enormous black owl, and his name translates roughly as he who knows 10,000 things, which is the sort of name you give yourself. He built a library, not a metaphorical library, an actual one, an enormous multi-story structure containing knowledge from across the entire world, and for a long time it stood above ground and people could walk into it. Then people used it for war. That's the whole story of the library, and Wan Shetong tells it plainly. Humans came, took what they wanted, and used it to get an advantage over other humans. So he sank the entire thing into the sand, leaving one spire poking out. And if you find that spire and climb down the rope, you can get in, and he will watch you the entire time. Team Avatar find it in Book 2. They are looking for information about the Fire Nation for the war, and Wan Shetong asks them directly what they intend to do with his collection, and they lie to him about it badly, and he knows immediately. And then Sokka finds the thing he's looking for, the Day of Black Sun, a solar eclipse on a specific date during which firebenders lose their bending entirely. It's in an astronomy wing that the Fire Nation had already found and burnt, and there's one scrap left that Sokka manages to read. He gets extremely excited about it, out loud, in front of the owl, and Wan Shetong, having been lied to, and then having watched a teenager celebrate finding a military secret in his archive, does exactly what he did the first time. He sinks the library. With everyone still in it, they get out. Just about. Appa doesn't, which is a separate problem we'll get to shortly, and the greatest single repository of knowledge in the world goes into the sand permanently because a boy from the Water Tribe couldn't keep his face straight. Now here's the theory, and it's less a theory than a reckoning. The eclipse plan does not work. That's the thing people forget. The invasion of the Fire Nation on the day of Black Sun, which the entire back half of Book 2 and most of Book 3 is building towards, is a failure. Azula knows they're coming. She's known for a long time. The Fire Nation capital is empty, the royal family's in a bunker, and the 8 minutes of eclipse tick away with nobody to use them on. The invasion force is captured. Half of them spend the rest of the war in prison. So the tally on the library is one civilization's complete collected knowledge, permanently lost, in exchange for a military operation that achieved essentially nothing. Sokka does eventually get a proper win, and I want to be fair to him because he's my favourite character in the show, and he spends most of it being underestimated by everyone, including the narrative. He plans the invasion, and the plan is good, and it fails for reasons entirely outside his control. He also, later, invents most of the mechanism by which the airship fleet gets stopped. He's not a fool, he just had a very bad afternoon in a library. But the library itself is one of the few genuinely irreversible losses in the show, and the show treats it as a set piece and moves on. Wan Shi Tong comes back in Korra incidentally, and he has not softened. He's living in the spirit world now, permanently, having given up on the physical one entirely, and his position on humans is that they are a species that turns knowledge into weapons and cannot be trusted with either. Given the sample size he's working from, I struggle to argue. There's a smaller thread in this that I find quite lovely, and it involves the Fire Nation astronomy wing. The reason that wing was burnt is that somebody from the Fire Nation got there first, found the eclipse information, understood immediately what it meant, and destroyed the rest so nobody else could work it out. That's a piece of institutional paranoia performed by an unnamed person, decades before the events of the show. And it very nearly worked. Sokka finds one fragment, that's all that survived. So the entire Day of Black Sun plot exists because one Fire Nation officer was slightly less thorough than they meant to be. I love that. It's the sort of detail that makes a world feel like it was happening before the camera arrived. And there's a broader idea underneath all of this that I think is the real point of the library, which is that this show has a consistent and slightly unusual attitude towards knowledge. Information in Avatar is almost never neutral. Hama's discovery liberates her and then ruins her. The Lion Turtle's technique resolves one crisis and creates several more. The Dai Li's knowledge of how memory works becomes a machine for erasing people. Wan Shi Tong's whole thesis is that humans convert understanding into harm, and the show keeps quietly agreeing with him, which is not a comfortable position for a children's program to take, and it never states it directly, and it's there in every single one of these stories once you start looking for it. One last thing about the library, and it's the bit that stayed with me. There's a fox. Wan Shi Tong has knowledge seeker foxes that fetch books and run errands for him, and one of them attaches itself to the group and helps them out. When the library sinks, we don't see what happens to the foxes. Presumably they were fine, they live there. But I remember watching that as a teenager and being far more concerned about the fox than about the collected knowledge of human civilization, which I suspect says something unflattering about how any of us actually process loss. And speaking of things that got left behind in that desert, we need to talk about the bison. There's a fairly widespread view in the fandom that the single most upsetting episode of Avatar isn't the one about the genocide, or the one about the bloodbending, or any of the finale. It's the one about the animal. Appa's Lost Days is episode 16 of Book 2, and its entire premise is that we've spent several episodes watching the humans look for Appa, and now we're going to find out what actually happened to him during that time, from his point of view. With no dialogue, he's taken from outside the library by sandbenders. They chain him. He's terrified, and he's enormous, and he fights, and they muzzle him, and they sell him. And then it's a sequence of increasingly awful situations, one after another, with no relief and no explanation. Because he's an animal, and nobody explains anything to animals. He ends up in a circus. There's a trainer with a whip and a chair. There are hoops of fire. which is a particularly cruel thing to make a flying bison jump through when you know what happened to his people, and the show absolutely knows what it's doing there. Appa has been through a fire once already, and it took everyone he knew. He escapes. Then he's attacked by a porcupine and injured. Then he's found by a boy called Teo's community, briefly, and it's kind, and then it ends. Then he's captured again, this time by the Fire Nation, and there's a genuinely unsettling stretch where he's being transported by a colonel who wants to use him as a war animal. And in between all of that, there are flashbacks. Appa remembers being a calf at the Southern Air Temple, and there's a scene where a very small Aang, maybe 5 or 6 years old, picks him out of a group of bison by offering him an apple. That's the structure of the episode. Suffering, cut with a memory of the one good thing. He eventually gets to Ba Sing Se, and the Guru Pathik finds him, and the last stretch is the closest the episode comes to mercy. But the point of the whole thing is that Appa spends the entire episode having no idea whether any of this ends, because he can't be told, and there's no mechanism by which anyone could tell him. I think that's why it hits harder than the human tragedies. Everyone else in this show gets to understand what's happening to them. Aang knows why he's grieving. Zuko knows why he was banished. Appa just knows he was somewhere with people who loved him, and now he isn't, and nobody has explained. Right, now the theory, and this one is bleak in a quiet way, the Avatar and the Avatar's animal companion are spiritually linked. That's established. It's not decorative. Guru Pathik uses Appa to locate Aang across a continent. The bond is described as their energies being mixed, and the show treats it as a real spiritual connection, rather than a strong friendship. And we have one clear data point on what happens at the end of that bond, which is Roku. Roku's animal companion was a dragon called Fang, and when Roku died in a volcanic eruption, Fang stayed with him, and died with him. Not out of loyalty in the last 30 seconds, though there's that too. The two of them go together. So the theory, which has been circulating essentially since Book 2, is that Appa died when Aang died, which would mean Appa lived roughly the same lifespan as Aang, saw the war end, saw a city built, saw 3 children born, and then went at the same moment as the boy who picked him out of a herd with an apple. And the reason I find that upsetting rather than sweet is the sky bison population question sitting underneath it. Appa is, for most of the series, believed to be the last flying bison in the world. Same event, same day, same comet. The air nomads and the sky bison went together because they lived together, and the bison were at the temples. There's a happier resolution to this in the comics and in Korra. The legend of Korra shows sky bison at the Northern Air Temple in numbers, which means somewhere in the intervening decades, a population was rebuilt from a very small starting point. Aang spent a large chunk of his adult life on that project, which incidentally is part of the same restoration effort that took him away from 2 of his children. But the maths on a single surviving male is what it is, and the show never spells out where the others came from. There's a strong assumption that some were found rather than bred. It's one of the few places where the franchise quite reasonably declines to show it's working. Momo I have less to say about, but there's one detail that I think is genuinely lovely and slightly sad. Momo is a winged lemur, and when Aang finds him at the Southern Air Temple, he's the only living thing left there. Not one of many, the only one. Aang names him after a fruit in a room full of the bones of his own people, about 10 minutes after finding Gyatso. That's what Aang does with grief, consistently, across the entire series. He finds the nearest living thing and attaches to it. Momo, Katara the swamp, a badger mole, whatever's available. It's not denial exactly, it's just that the alternative is standing still in that room. And there's a small piece of production trivia that makes me laugh every time. Both Appa and Momo, and a huge percentage of the animal noises in the entire series, are D. Bradley Baker, one man making bison noises for 3 seasons, and then a film in 2026 where he's still doing it. Somebody has to, and he's extremely good at it. Since we're talking about people who disappeared, there's one disappearance the show hung an entire mystery on, and then took several years to answer. The show ends without answering it. That's worth stating first because a lot of people misremember this. The final scene of the entire series after the war is over and everyone is sitting in a tea shop is Zuko visiting his father in prison and asking him where his mother is. And then it stops. Credits. That question sat there for 4 years. Here's the setup, assembled from flashbacks across Book 3. Fire Lord Azulon, Ozai's father, is old and near the end. Ozai wants the throne, and the throne belongs by right to his older brother Iroh, who has just lost his son at Ba Sing Se and abandoned the siege. Ozai goes to his father and argues that a man with no heir shouldn't inherit, and that the succession should pass to him instead. Azulon does not take this well, and the punishment he chooses is precise and appalling. He tells Ozai that since he apparently doesn't understand what it means to lose a son, he's going to find out. He orders Ozai to kill Zuko. Azula overhears this and cheerfully tells her brother about it. Ursa overhears Azula, and then Azulon dies that night, and Ozai becomes Fire Lord, and Ursa is gone by morning, and Zuko is told his mother is banished, and never gets a straight answer about anything. So the obvious reading, and the one the fandom ran with for years, is that Ursa killed Azulon to save her son, and paid for it with exile. Which is broadly right, but it's not the whole thing, and the whole thing is stranger. The comics answered it. The Search 3 volumes, published across 2013 by Dark Horse, written by Jean Luen Yang with the creators involved. And they went somewhere I don't think anyone predicted. Ursa did poison Azulon, using something she'd had made. Her arrangement with Ozai was that she'd do it, and he'd spare Zuko, and in exchange she'd leave and never return. But before all of that, before she was ever in the palace, Ursa had a life. She was from a small town called Hira'a. She was in love with a man called Ikem, and she was taken to the capital and married to Ozai because of her bloodline, specifically because she was a descendant of Avatar Roku, and the royal family wanted that line back in the family. So her marriage was a genetics decision made by other people. After the banishment, she went home. And then she went to find a spirit, the Mother of Faces, the one we talked about earlier. Ko's mother, the spirit who assigns identities. Ursa asked her for a new face and, crucially, for the removal of her memories. She wanted to stop being Ursa, not to hide, to not have been her, and she got it. She became a woman called Noriko, married Ikem, who had also had his face changed, had a daughter, and lived a completely ordinary life in a village with no memory that she'd ever had 2 other children. Zuko finds her, and what he finds is a stranger who doesn't recognise him, living happily, who chose this. I think that's a far more upsetting answer than the ones people were guessing. Everyone assumed she'd been killed or imprisoned or was hiding somewhere waiting to be rescued. All of those are tragedies that make the rescuer a hero. This one doesn't. She was found and she was fine, and being fine required her to not be his mother. She does get her memories back by the end of it, and there's a reunion, and it's handled well. But the middle section of that story, where Zuko is standing in front of his mother, and she is looking at him politely, is one of the harder things the franchise has done. And Azula is there for all of it, which makes it worse. The Search is largely Azula's story as well, and she is not in a good state, and watching her process, the discovery that her mother voluntarily erased her, is genuinely difficult. There's one more piece of this that I think is the most elegant bit of plotting in the entire franchise, and it's about Zuko's ancestry. Zuko's father's line goes back to Fire Lord Sozin, the man who started the war and committed the genocide. Zuko's mother's line goes back to Avatar Roku, Sozin's childhood best friend, the man who could have stopped him and didn't, and who died because Sozin left him too. So Zuko is a direct descendant of both of them. Both sides of that friendship end up in one teenager, and his entire arc is a 100-year argument between two dead men working itself out in a boy who doesn't know he's carrying it. Iroh is the one who tells him, and the way Iroh frames it is that this is not a curse and not a destiny. It just means both possibilities are in him and he gets to pick, which is, I think, the single best thing anybody says in the show. And it's a fair bit better than what he's given elsewhere, because I'll be honest, Iroh gets handed some absolute clangers in the back half of Book 3. The man is the wisest character in the franchise, and at one point his advice is essentially to trust in one's own strength while looking meaningfully into the middle distance. He's earned it, but there is a version of Iroh in Season 3 who has become slightly too aware that he is Uncle Iroh. Anyway, one last section, and then I'll leave you alone. Republic City is Aang's monument, and it is a mess. Here's the intention. After the war, the Fire Nation had colonies across the Earth Kingdom that had been there for generations. Actual towns with actual populations where Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom people had been living together and intermarrying for generations. The tidy solution was to send everyone home, and the comics spend an entire trilogy, The Promise, on the discovery that this is impossible, because there are people whose home is the colony and whose parents are from two different nations. So instead of unpicking it, Aang and Zuko took the largest colony and turned it into something new, a city belonging to no nation where anyone could live, run by a council with a representative from each of the four nations. The United Republic, genuinely idealistic, genuinely well-intentioned, absolutely the right instinct. And 70 years later, when we arrive in the legend of Korra, it is a 1920s metropolis with organised crime, extreme wealth inequality, an unelected council, and a police force run by benders with a great deal of latitude. Now I want to be careful here, because there's a lazy version of this argument that says Aang failed, and I don't think that's right. Republic City is not a dystopia. It's just a city. It has traffic and newspapers and a professional sports league, and people who are doing fine and people who are not. And it has the specific problems that any large multi-ethnic city acquires in its first few decades. The theory that interests me is narrower, and it's about the police. Toph founded the metal-bending police force. Same pattern as Kyoshi, if you want to draw the line. And I do. A hero with excellent intentions builds an institution. The institution outlives her understanding of it, and it becomes a thing that people in the city have complicated feelings about. And the specific complication is that the police in Republic City are, by design, benders. Metal benders, specifically, using a technique Toph invented, which means law enforcement in a mixed city is drawn exclusively from one part of the population and enforced on all of it, which is where Ammon comes from. The Equalists are the antagonists of the first season of Korra, and their position is that benders hold structural power in the city and non-benders don't, and that this is not a coincidence or a temporary situation, but the actual design of the place. And the show, to its considerable credit, does not pretend they've got nothing. Look at the evidence they're working from. The council includes no non-bender representation. The police are benders. The city's most popular sport is a bending sport. The crime syndicates are bender gangs, running protection rackets on shopkeepers who cannot fight back in any meaningful way. There's a scene early in the season of exactly that happening, and it's not framed as an aberration. Armin himself is a fraud, obviously. He is not a non-bender who was scarred by benders as a child. He's Noatak, the son of the bloodbender Yarkone, and he is himself one of the most powerful bloodbenders who has ever lived. And the technique he uses to permanently remove people's bending is bloodbending applied with extraordinary precision. His entire movement is a lie told by a man who has the thing he claims to be liberating people from. What the show does next is genuinely sophisticated. Exposing him as a fraud does not solve the underlying problem, it just ends his movement. The grievance was real, the leader was a fake, and the season ends with the fake exposed, and the grievance entirely unaddressed. And the following 3 seasons are, in a sense, the city gradually working through it. There's an election eventually, structures change, it gets messier before it gets better. So the reading I'd offer, and this is my own rather than a fandom staple, is that Republic City is the most honest thing in the entire franchise about what winning actually gets you. Aang's generation ended a 100-year war and then had to go and do administration. And administration is where the real difficulty lives, because there's no comet and no final battle and no moment where the problem is defeated. There's just a city filling up with people, generating new problems faster than anyone can solve the old ones. The show could very easily have skipped that. Most franchises do. You win the war, you get a victory parade, and the sequel invents a bigger war. Instead, the sequel says, here's the city he built. It's got a housing problem, and a policing problem, and a corruption problem, and the man who built it is dead, and his statue is in the harbour, looking out at all of it. That statue, by the way, is a lovely piece of design. It's enormous, it's in the bay, and it's a serene, bald man with an arrow. And every single episode of Korra, it is just there in the background, while the city gets on with being complicated. One thing I'll add, because it connects to something from earlier. Katara outlives essentially everyone. She's in the Southern Water Tribe when Korra's story starts, in her 80s, and she's the last living link to the original cast. She trains Korra in healing. She's there for the whole thing, and in one episode, she talks about Aang, and she says something to the effect that he'd had a long life, and he'd been happy, and she doesn't romanticize any of it. She just misses him. There's a bit of the fandom that finds Katara's later years disappointing, on the grounds that she was the most powerful waterbender of her generation, and ends up as an elderly healer in the place she started. I understand the objection, and I don't share it. She went home. She trained the next one. She's the reason Korra can heal at all. Not every arc has to end somewhere else. Everything in this video comes out of one friendship going wrong. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not a fan reading, it's the plot. There's an episode in Book 3 called The Avatar and the Fire Lord, which is essentially a 40-minute origin story for the entire 100-year war, and it's structured as 2 parallel flashbacks, and it might be the best single episode of television the franchise produced. Roku and Sozin were born on the same day. They grew up together in the Fire Nation capital. Sozin was the prince, Roku was not, and they were genuinely close in the way you can only be with somebody you've known since before you had opinions. They shared a birthday party. They practiced fire bending together. Sozin gave Roku his own royal headpiece as a wedding gift, and then Roku was told he was the Avatar, and had to leave for 12 years to learn the other 3 elements, and by the time he came back, Sozin was Fire Lord. The moment it breaks is small. Sozin, now on the throne, tells his old friend about an idea he's been developing. The Fire Nation is enjoying an unprecedented period of prosperity, and he thinks it would be selfish not to share that prosperity with the rest of the world. He wants to expand. He wants Roku, as the Avatar, to help. Roku says no, immediately, flatly, and without much discussion. The 4 nations exist as they are for a reason, and it's not the Avatar's job to help one of them absorb the others. And then Sozin does it anyway, quietly, over years, and Roku finds out and comes back and destroys a large part of the palace and stands over his oldest friend and tells him that if he ever does anything like this again, he'll end him, and then he leaves and doesn't follow up. That's the failure, not the confrontation, which he wins, the lack of a follow-up. Roku had a Fire Lord on the floor of his own throne room, and he chose to trust that a warning would be enough, because this was a man he'd known since childhood, and you don't remove someone you grew up with. You give them another chance. 25 years later, the volcano on Roku's island erupts. Roku fights it because there's a town in the way, and he's holding back a volcano essentially on his own. And it's too much. And Sozin arrives on a dragon, unprompted. He comes because he saw the eruption and he knew where Roku lived. And for a few minutes, the two of them are working together against the mountain, and it looks like the friendship survived after all. Then Roku breathes in a lungful of volcanic gas and goes down. And Sozin looks at his oldest friend on the ground, unable to move, and makes a decision. He says out loud that without Roku, all his plans are suddenly possible, and he gets on his dragon and leaves him there. Fang, Roku's dragon, stays. The island goes under. That's the moment. Everything else follows mechanically from there. Roku dies, so the next avatar is an air nomad, so Sozin waits for the comet and wipes out the air nomads. So a 12-year-old wakes up in an iceberg, a century later, with nobody left. And the detail that makes it properly unbearable is that Sozin doesn't murder him. He just declines to help. There's no killing blow. He decides in about 4 seconds that the most convenient thing available to him is to do nothing, and then he does nothing extremely efficiently. Roku's own assessment, delivered to Aang inside his head decades later, is that this was his fault. Not Sozin's, his. His words are that he let his friendship with Sozin cloud his judgment, and that Aang must be more decisive than he was. Which is a strange thing to hear from a man who was left to suffocate by somebody he loved. Now the wrinkle. There's a second flashback running in that episode, and it's about Iroh's grandfather, and the whole thing is framed as Aang being shown that his enemy's family and his own past are more tangled than he realises. Roku's granddaughter married Sozin's grandson. That's the Ursa connection we went through. Zuko has both of them in him, and what Aang takes from the episode is the opposite of what Roku intended. Roku is telling him to be decisive. Aang concludes that anyone is capable of change and holds on to that all the way to the beach with the lion turtle. So the two big moral positions of the finale are both descended from this one episode, and they point in opposite directions, and the episode is deliberately constructed so that both readings are available. I have one genuinely soft spot in all of this, and it's Sozin's ending. He lived to be over 100. He wiped out a people, started a war, and never found the Avatar. And he spent his final years writing, and what he wrote was largely about Roku. Not regret exactly, something more like an old man returning to the only relationship that ever mattered to him and turning it over. His last recorded thoughts are about the friend he left in the ash. I don't think that redeems him, and the show doesn't either, but it's an unusually generous thing for a children's program to include, and it's the closest the franchise ever gets to saying that the man who did the worst thing in its history was a person, and that the worst thing started with him being disappointed by his mate. Not every theory needs to be devastating, and after everything we've been through tonight, I'd like to spend a bit of time on the ones that are mostly just fun. Start with Sokka's sword. In Book 3, Sokka finally gets a proper weapon. He takes a meteorite that fell near a village, has it forged into a black sword, and trains under a swordmaster called Pian Dao. It's a lovely arc. It's the point at which the show stops treating him as comic relief, and the sword is genuinely his in a way nothing else is. The theory is that Yui sent it. Yui is the princess of the Northern Water Tribe, who at the end of Book 1 gives her life back to the moon spirit and becomes the moon. She and Sokka had a brief doomed thing, and her last line to him is that she'll always be with him. So the reading is that a meteorite arriving conveniently near Sokka, made of a material nobody in the world has, at the precise point in his arc when he needs to stop feeling useless, is not weather. It's a gift from the sky, from somebody who is now, quite literally, in the sky. There's absolutely nothing supporting this in the text. It's not confirmed, it's not hinted at, and the meteor is set up as a fun science moment about space rocks. But I've never met a fan who didn't like it, and I include myself. and I think that tells you something about what fan theories are actually for. Next one, Sokka and Toph. In The Legend of Korra, Toph has 2 daughters by 2 different fathers, and she names Lin's father as Kanto, while never identifying Suyin's. One of them, Suyin, has a father who is never identified in the show or in any of the supplementary material. A large chunk of the fandom decided it was Sokka. The evidence is essentially vibes. There's a bit of a dynamic in the original show. They'd have known each other for decades, and Suyin's whole personality is a blend of Toph's bluntness and somebody else's willingness to build things. And the creators, when asked, have consistently declined to answer, which the fandom correctly reads as deliberate. It's not confirmed, it's not denied, it's the sort of gap a franchise leaves on purpose, because the speculation is more fun than the answer. Here's a bigger one, and this is the theory I think is most quietly clever. The idea is that Aang's 3 teachers are not a coincidence. He needs to learn water, earth and fire. He is taught water by Katara, earth by Toph, and fire by Zuko. All 3 of them are prodigies. Katara goes from complete novice to master in under a year. Toph invents metal bending as a child. Zuko learns to firebend from the original source and rederives the entire discipline. The theory is that these 3 would have been the Avatar if the cycle hadn't broken. Or, in a softer version, that they are the reincarnations of the Avatar's previous friends and teachers, showing up in each life, so the learning process isn't started from scratch every time. It's completely unsupported. The mechanics of the Avatar cycle, as we understand them, don't allow for it, and it's an elegant explanation for something the show never bothers to explain, which is why one 12-year-old happened to fall in with the 3 most gifted benders of their generation. There's a rougher version of the same instinct, which is that Sokka was meant to be the Avatar. The argument runs that if Aang had died in the storm, rather than freezing, the cycle would have moved to water, and Sokka is roughly the right age, and from the right tribe. It's a bit of a stretch and the maths doesn't quite work, but I like the idea of a version of this show, where the Avatar is the one who makes the plans and can't bend at all. And the reason I wanted to spend a section on these, rather than finishing on the heavy material, is that I think fan theories in this fandom do something slightly unusual. Most large fandoms generate theories to fill plot holes. This one mostly doesn't, because the plot is unusually tight. 61 episodes, 3 seasons, almost nothing wasted, planned as a complete story from the start and allowed to finish. There aren't that many holes. So what the Avatar fandom has spent all this time doing instead is filling emotional gaps. Not what happened, but what it felt like. Did Gyatso have a last act of defiance? Was somebody looking out for Sokka? Did Appa go with him at the end? Was Ummi still in there somewhere? Nearly every theory we've talked about tonight is somebody deciding they need a bit more of the story than they were given, in the specific place where the story hurt. Which is why they're so durable. You can't disprove them, because they were never really claims. They're wishes with evidence attached. And that includes the horrible ones. The people who want the whole world to be a purgatory, or a coma dream, or a punishment, are doing the same thing in reverse. They want it to mean something, and if it can't mean something kind, it'll do if it means something terrible. Avatar is unusual in that the show mostly gets there first. It really does have a genocide in it. It really does have a brainwashing facility and a torture technique invented in a cell, and a 14-year-old having a breakdown on a rooftop. The fandom hasn't had to invent much. They've mostly just had to look slightly harder at what was already on screen at 4 p.m. on a children's channel. One thing this franchise is unusually clear-eyed about is that the spirit world is not a nicer version of the physical one. Most fantasy does the opposite. The spirits are wise, the spirits are ancient, and when the protagonist finally reaches them, they get answers and encouragement, and possibly a sword. Avatar's spirits are not like that. They are enormous, they are largely indifferent to human concerns, and when they do take an interest, it usually goes badly for somebody. Start with the first one Aang meets, which is Hei Bai. Hei Bai is the spirit of a forest, and when we encounter him, he's a rampaging black and white monster who is smashing a village and abducting the villagers. It's presented as a monster of the week for about 10 minutes, and then Aang works out what's actually happened, which is that the forest is gone. The Fire Nation burned it. Hei Bai is not attacking a village because he's evil. He's attacking it because his forest, which is to say his body, which is to say his entire reason for existing, has been converted into ash by an army that was passing through. Aang shows him a single surviving acorn. That's the resolution. A tiny green thing held up, and the spirit calms down and gives the villagers back and returns to being a panda. Because the forest will grow again, and Hei Bai's timescale is not our timescale. And the problem was never that he was angry with people, it was that he thought it was over. 10 minutes, first season, on a Friday afternoon. The river spirit in the Painted Lady episode is the same idea with the volume up. A village prays to her about a poisoned river, and she does not come, and they assume they've done something wrong. She hasn't come because rivers do not answer prayers about industrial runoff. It takes Katara impersonating her and blowing up a factory to fix it, which is a human solution to a human problem, and the spirit turns up afterwards to say thank you. That's the pattern across the whole franchise. Spirits are enormously powerful and almost completely unable to help you with anything that a human being built. Then there's the swamp, which I think is the most genuinely strange episode of the original run, and which nobody talks about enough. Team Avatar gets pulled into an enormous swamp in the Earth Kingdom by a tornado, gets separated, and each of them sees somebody. Katara sees her mother. Sokka sees Yue. Aang sees a girl he doesn't recognize, in a flying boar mask, who runs away laughing, and then they meet the Swamp Benders, who are a small community of waterbenders nobody knew existed, living in the roots, and their explanation for the whole thing is the most direct statement of the show's metaphysics that we ever get. The swamp is one tree. All of it. Every trunk you can see is part of a single organism with a shared root system, and their extension of that idea is that everything else works the same way. Time is an illusion, death is an illusion, and everyone you have ever lost is still connected to you because separation is a thing your eyes do rather than a thing that exists. That's a fairly heavy load for an episode that also features a man wrestling a cat gator. And then the payoff, which lands 2 episodes later. The girl in the flying boar mask is Toph. Aang saw her before he met her, because in the swamp the distinction between before and after had gone a bit soft. The show does not explain this. It puts it in Book 2 in a vision, and then quietly resolves it in Book 2 by having Toph turn up with a flying boar as her family crest and the audience going, "Oh, I love it." It's the sort of thing you only get from a show with an actual plan. Now, the theory strand in this area is about what the spirit world does to the people who go there, and it's a consistent through line that nobody ever states. Kuruk went there repeatedly and was destroyed by it. That's explicit in the novels. The spiritual sickness that killed him at 33 came from crossing over too often and fighting things that live there. Aang goes and comes back mostly intact, but he goes as a child and he goes with a guide most of the time, and the one occasion he goes deep and alone, he ends up sitting in front of Ko, being told to keep his face still. Korra goes there more than any avatar we've seen, and the spirit world is where she does most of her healing, and it is also where she loses everything. Harmonic convergence happens there. Her past lives go there, and the 2 people in the franchise who understand the spirit world best are Iroh and Wan Shi Tong, and one of them went there permanently and never came back, and the other one gave up on humans entirely. Iroh is the interesting case because the show is extremely coy about it. There are references throughout the original series to Iroh having travelled to the spirit world at some point, and it's never dramatised, and it's mentioned in passing as though it's a thing you might do on a gap year. Fans have spent a long time trying to work out when it happened and what he did there. The strongest reading, and it's popular enough to be close to consensus, is that he went after Lu Ten died. He lost his son at Ba Sing Se, walked away from the siege and the throne, and went looking. And whatever he found or didn't find is where the version of Iroh we meet comes from. The tea, the patience, the refusal to be in a hurry about anything. And then Korra shows us where he ended up, which is a tea shop in the spirit world, permanently, apparently happy. He chose to go and stay. The franchise does in fact explain that decision through Iroh's brief explanation to Korra. Iroh just tells Korra that he found what he was looking for, and he'd rather be here now, and she doesn't push, and neither does the show. Which brings me to the thing I actually find most interesting about the spirits, and it's a structural observation rather than a theory. In the original series, spirits are essentially weather. They exist, they occasionally affect you, and the correct approach is respect and distance. The world is a human world with spirits at the edges of it. By the end of Korra, they're everywhere. Harmonic convergence left the barrier permanently open. Spirit vines grew through the middle of Republic City, and spirits and humans are now sharing space in a way they haven't since one's time 10,000 years earlier. And Seven Havens, from what's been shown so far, takes place in a world that's been broken by a cataclysm, where humanity is down to a handful of strongholds, and the new Avatar is being hunted by human and spirit enemies alike. So the arc of the franchise across 3 series is spirits at the edges, spirits at the door, spirits inside. I don't know whether that's where they always meant to go. I doubt it, honestly, given how long the gaps between these projects have been and how much of the material was made by different teams under different circumstances. But it does read like a direction, and it's a direction that runs against the grain of what most people think Avatar is about. The original show is about balance between 4 nations, 4 human nations, 4 human cultures, 4 human armies. The spirits are set dressing with occasional plot relevance. Everything since has been slowly making the case that the 4 nations were never the actual balance. They were a local arrangement inside a much older one, between 2 things that have been fighting since before anyone was around to name them, and the Avatar is the piece of equipment that keeps that argument stable. Which is a hell of a thing to do to a story that opens with 2 kids in a canoe arguing about fish. I want to finish the body of this with something that isn't grim, because we've had a lot of grim, and there's a theory I've been saving that I think is the best one in the fandom precisely because it isn't a horror, it's about the tea shop. The last scene of the original series takes place in the Jasmine Dragon, Iroh's tea shop in Ba Sing Se. The war is over, everybody is there. Aang is painting badly, Sokka is drawing badly, Toph is delighted by how badly, Zuko and Katara are having a quiet conversation, and Iroh is pouring. And the theory, which has been floating around in various forms for years, is that this is the actual thesis of the whole show, and that everything else is the plot. Here's the case for it. Every single character in the main cast is somebody who lost their family and then built a replacement out of whatever was to hand. Aang's people are dead. Katara and Sokka's mother was killed, and their father left to fight the war. Toph's parents kept her indoors for 12 years and treated her as fragile, which is a different kind of losing them. Zuko was burned by his father and abandoned by his mother. Suki's an orphan by implication. Iroh lost his son. And what all of them do individually, without ever discussing it, is find each other and decide that this will do. The show never says this. There's no scene where somebody makes a speech about how they're all a family now. It just quietly arranges for a group of people with holes in them to sit in a room together at the end and be fine. I find that a much more interesting reading than any of the dark ones, and I think it's why the show has held up for 20 years, while a lot of its contemporaries haven't. The darkness is real, and the show doesn't flinch from it, but the darkness isn't the point. The point is what people do afterwards, and you can test this against basically any character. Zuko's arc is usually described as a redemption arc, and it is, but the thing that actually turns him is not a moral realization. It's Iroh. It's 3 seasons of one man being reliably present. Zuko spends most of Book 2 treating Iroh appallingly, and Iroh keeps making tea, and eventually that wears through. Katara's arc is about deciding not to become Hammer, not in the sense of the technique, in the sense of what happens to a person who lets a loss become their whole personality. She gets to the man who killed her mother, and stands over him and chooses not to, and she doesn't forgive him either. She just declines to hand him her life. Aang's whole thing is that he refuses to trade what he is for what he needs, and the show gives him a giant turtle so he doesn't have to, and I've already told you what I think about the timing of that. But the instinct is consistent all the way through, even in the temple, even standing over Gyatso. What pulls him back is somebody standing next to him. And Iroh, honestly, is the argument in one man. He lost a son, walked away from a throne, and spent the rest of his life making tea for people who needed it, including a nephew, who was not his son, and who was, for a long stretch, extremely hard work. There's a version of Iroh who becomes bitter. That version exists. We've seen roughly that version tonight, in several forms. He just decided not to. So if you want a theory to take away from all of this, that's the one I'd offer. Not that the world is secretly a punishment, and not that the Avatar is a containment vessel for a cosmic argument, although that one is genuinely well supported, and I do think about it. There's a small piece of evidence for this that I've always liked, and it's about how the show ends its individual episodes, rather than how it ends its story. Almost nothing in Avatar resolves with a victory. Go back and check. The Hey Bye episode ends with an acorn. The Ba Sing Se anthology ends with a man singing to a picture. The Boiling Rock ends with a family being partially reassembled in a stolen airship. The Swamp episode ends with a group of people who've just seen their dead relatives having a slightly awkward lunch. Even the Invasion, which is a total military failure, ends with a father telling his son to go and get on with it. The template for an Avatar ending is not triumph. It's somebody being slightly less alone than they were at the start of the episode. And once you see that, the finale reads differently too. The big set pieces are all there, the comet and the airships and the lightning, and none of them are the last thing you see. The last thing you see is Aang and Katara kissing on the balcony of Iroh's tea shop overlooking Ba Sing Se. The other thing I'd point at is, who gets the final word? It isn't Aang. It isn't Zuko, who technically has the most conventional arc in the whole thing. The series ends on a wide shot of a group of people who have no biological reason to be sitting together, doing very ordinary things in a shop owned by a man who lost his son. That's an unusually quiet note to end a war on, and it's a deliberate one. The show could have ended on the throne room. It could have ended on the statue, or the beach, or any number of images with more scale to them. It ends on tea, because tea is what the show actually thinks the answer is. I'm aware that's a slightly ridiculous sentence to say out loud, at whatever time it currently is. I stand by it. The theory is that this is a show about the specific, unglamorous work of surviving something and then having to keep living afterwards, and that it disguised itself as a cartoon about a boy with an arrow on his head, so that it could get away with it on a children's network for 3 years. I think it got away with it completely. Right, that's about where I'm going to leave it. There's a thing that Avatar keeps promising all the way through, which is that everything comes back. The seasons come back. The Avatar comes back. Balance comes back. The whole system is built on the idea that nothing is ever permanently lost. It just goes round again. And nearly every theory we've been through tonight is a version of the same question, which is whether coming round again is actually a kindness. It wasn't for Kuruk. It wasn't for Cora, losing every version of herself in one afternoon. It might not be for whoever's next, in a world that's decided the Avatar is the problem. I don't have a neat answer to that, and I don't think the show does either, which is probably why people are still arguing about it 2 decades on. There's a lot I didn't get to. The Kyoshi novels on their own are worth a whole video, and I've barely touched the Yang Chen ones. The comics have several threads I skipped entirely, and there's an enormous amount in Korra I glossed over in a paragraph. I'll do those properly at some point. Thanks for having this on. Sleep well.